Welcome to A Voice and Beyond. We have a very special guest today. We have John R. Miles. How are you, John?
Marissa, I am doing fantastic. Thank you so much for bringing me on your great show. It's great to see you again.
Well, you've had some success recently. Not only are you a keynote speaker, but you've authored a new book, Passion Struck 12 Powerful Principles to Unlock Your Purpose and Ignite Your Most Intentional Life. Now, this was only released in February, and you've just shared with me that it's won some awards or an award and up for some awards as
Yeah,
well.
we've been so fortunate and it's so humbling. The book was recognized by the Next Big Idea Club as one of their February must reads, and it now goes into their bigger competition of books throughout the year in different categories, plus their book of the year. We ended up winning the Best Business Minds award for best book of the year for 2024, which
Amazing.
was really a complete shock. And right now, we're a finalist for best debut book for the Eric Hoffer Awards. And we'll find more about that towards the end of April. So, real excited about those and just completely humbled that the book is resonating with so many people.
That's fantastic. And I think I shared with you before we started recording that when I released my book, I was just lucky to have it. I felt so privileged that it had been published. The fact that you've won all these awards, I can't even imagine how that must make you feel, but well done. Now, you have quite an interesting background, though. And all of this has led to you writing your book. You were a combat veteran, or you are a combat veteran and the host of the #1 ranked alternative health podcast, Passion Struck, with John R. Miles. And you've had over 17 plus million downloads. Now, I can say right now, I'm very envious of that. And it is listened to in 169 countries and has well over 20,000 five-star reviews. So well done on all your successes. Now, you do have an interesting background because you did work for a Fortune 500 company as well. But tell us about your story, John Miles. Who is John Miles, and what is the journey that has led to you writing this book?
Yeah, Marissa, I guess you could say I've always been a person who has taken the road less traveled throughout my entire life. And I think that really started when I was a kid. And at 5 years old, was just playing tag in our side yard with a bunch of other children. And we kept getting rougher and rougher as we were playing, as little boys do. And one of my neighbors just happened to catch me in the back right at the right time or wrong moment as it is. And
Mm.
I went flying through the air, landed through our basement window, and ended up getting a traumatic brain injury, which ended up causing a whole number of issues for me, including a speech impediment, migraine issues, cognitive issues, and finding words and using them properly, other vision issues. And so, even at a young age, I was forced to have to overcome resilience and choose whether I was going to play the victim or whether I was going to do something and find my way out of it, because I was getting sick of the kids teasing me that I
Oh,
was broken in some way. So that really led this inner drive for me to want to make something out of my life. And so when I came to the time in life when I had to choose university, I made the choice again to go to the Naval Academy instead of your typical university,
yes.
because I thought it was a phenomenal place to foster leadership skills. I wanted to follow in the footsteps of my grandfather and my father before me, serve my country. And also, I just figured I'm never going to have the opportunities and experiences like I would have from that starting my journey. And
Mm.
that's exactly what happened. I ended up graduating, had a great time when I was in the service working for the National Security Agency, got to deploy throughout all areas of the world. Saw my time in Iraq and in the Yugoslavia conflict, Northern
Wow.
Africa, and other things. And the only reason I really left the military was because I had an opportunity to join the Federal Bureau of Investigation as a special agent,
Mhm.
and ended up having my Quantico class set up for about a week after I got out of the military. And unfortunately, our Congress was having some of the same interfighting politics that were going on then. So they couldn't pass a budget. And my class ended up getting canceled and recycled 3 years later. And by the time it came about, I had to move to plan B because I had a kid at that point and life had just taken a different turn. And so I spent the next 6, 7 years in management consulting when another unexpected turn happened. I was working as a practice leader for Arthur Andersen, if people remember that firm, when Enron happened and in a matter of weeks took the whole firm down. So then I had to do another unexpected pivot, which brought me to Australia, of all places, because I took
Wow.
a job working for Lendlease.
Oh, yes, I know Lend-Lease. Yes, they're big corporate property managers or leasing managers.
Yeah, when I was with them, the company was a little bit different. It wasn't just the construction business. We also owned MLC, which was
Mm.
sold to National Australian Bank. We also had a real estate investment trust and a whole myriad of different mutual funds. So it was both a financial services company and the property company that it's known as today. In fact, at that time, Australia owned 50% of IBM Asia.
Wow, I
So
didn't know that.
yeah, it was a top 10 Australian stock exchange traded company at that point in time. Lots have
Mhm.
changed over the past 20 years, but I went from there to then Lowe's Home Improvement, where I ended up being the head of all data, kind of what they call a chief data officer today by the time I left. And that springboard into me becoming a CIO at Dell Computers. And then following that, I really pivoted into private equity and was a partner in a private equity firm and would go and lead the rebuilding of many of their companies. So I ended up becoming the CEO for 3 or 4 of the portfolio before eventually finding my way into what I'm doing now.
So there did come a point throughout that journey where you say that you were feeling directionless, lonely, and bored. So why do you think you started feeling that way? Because externally, you would have looked like you had a very successful, a great life going on, but there must have been something missing intrinsically. So when was that moment of self-realization? And how did you pinpoint what was actually going on with you?
Yeah, I think I was facing what many people are facing today, this feeling that Henry David Thoreau, all the way back when he wrote on Walden, that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. And that's how I actually felt. I had wound up in what I consider to be kind of a portfolio career, moving up the ladder, doing different things to try to make more money, gain titles, do all the things people do in corporations. And it was so foreign from anything that I even dreamt of doing when I was a
Mm,
kid.
mm,
When I was a kid, I kind of dreamt of being a professional sports athlete or being an FBI agent, like
yeah.
I thought my career was going to go, or being in the military, something where I was not just sitting behind a desk, but had a more action filled life. And when the plan B was put into effect, I found myself on this path that after a good 12 to 15 years into it was anything but fulfilling for me. In
Mm,
fact, it had reached a point where I was just waking up every single day and just dreading to go to work because once I had achieved becoming a C level, almost all the things that I had a passion for doing, the
mm.
creative aspects of my life, being hands-on in shaping things, all were removed as I was dealing more and more with politics across the organization, human resources issues, and really financial management of $1.5 billion budget. but
Mm.
I wasn't doing the things that really lit me up inside. And I
Yes.
found at work, it was just a myriad of meetings, politics, emails, and stress upon stress, and working 80 to 100-hour weeks every single week,
Mm.
traveling 2 weeks out of the month overseas because I had staff in 15 different countries and 5 continents. So it was just a life that I think on the outside looking at the resume looked glorious if you didn't
Yes.
understand
Yes.
what it was like actually living it.
Hmm.
And when your life gets out of balance, like was happening with me, you start making sacrifices along the way. And it's one of those things where I'm not going to work out today because I need to get this done. And then that leads to it making it easier to say that the next time. And then
Yes.
you start losing your eating habits when you're on all these global trips and you're not eating the healthy diet that you're supposed to. And so all of a
Mm.
sudden, other areas of your life get completely out of whack. And I
Yes.
just found myself in complete inner turmoil. And when you don't catch yourself quickly enough when that's happening, you can really go from kind of a midline baseline to all of a
Mm.
sudden just spiraling out of control, especially if burnout starts compounding things, which it did for me. And
Mm.
so I just found myself in a position where I just felt at one point completely numb, and that I was just going through the motions, and that nothing I was doing seemed like it was really holding any weight or creating any significance in my life.
Mm.
And that's a terrible place to be. And I think that's exactly
Yes.
what Henry David Thoreau meant when he said quiet desperation, because you feel like you were just stuck and you can't figure out how to break free.
Mm. I would imagine there'd be a lot of people listening to what you're saying right now. They may not be in a corporate job, but would be feeling what you're describing, because so many people go through the motions every day. They're in jobs that they absolutely do not want to get out of bed for. And the word congruent was coming to mind. You weren't living a congruent life to who you were meant to be and the things that you wanted to aspire to do in your life. Most people stay stuck in that. But how did you get yourself out of that? I mean, that would have taken a lot of courage to leave such a high paying job where obviously you had no financial problems. And as you say, on paper and observing your life from the outside would have been, wow, this guy's got it all: travel, money, a fantastic job. So how did you overcome those challenges, and what steps did you take to make change in your life?
Well, Marissa, I don't care if you're making millions of dollars or you're making $80,000,
Mm.
no matter where you're at, it seems extremely difficult to do something different when you're so accustomed to living the life that you are.
Yes,
And I just want
agreed.
to put a figure out there. I mean, Gallup in the past years has shown that there are over 900 million people in 142 countries who feel unfulfilled about what they
Oh,
do in life. And when they say 900 million, they're measuring that against the 1.2 billion full-time workers, which means 900 million out of 1.2 billion
mm,
feel unfulfilled. So this is a really
that,
pervasive
yeah,
issue.
yes. Wow, that's an incredible figure.
Yeah. And so for me, it was really coming down to understanding that I wasn't living authentically. And I came to the stark realization that the quest for authentic living was completely on the other spectrum of the life I was leading, because it's not about the superficial pursuit
Mm.
of monetary pleasures. It's not about the status symbols that we get. To me, it became a deeper rebellion against societal norms that dictate so many of our lives. And for me, it became a refusal to settle for a life that was being defined by someone else's standards. It was really breaking away from quiet desperation and reclaiming the power to author my own story and to create the life that I wanted. And I got here because when I was at this period of brokenness, I started doing some of the most crucial work around mindfulness and self
Mm,
awareness and really relearning who I was and what brought me joy and fulfillment in my life. I had to get back to the basics of understanding what made me unique and how do I exploit that in serving others. I had started to hear this inner voice that was telling me that I was supposed to start helping the beaten, the battered, the broken, the lonely, the hopeless,
mm,
the bored of the world. But I had no idea what that meant, nor how does a person who's a business executive start doing that? Like, what am I supposed to be offering? Who are even these people? And so I really started to go down this journey of what I talk about in the book is crafting a new life for myself. And I use the analogy, which many people in Australia will understand, of being an angler. I call it the mission angler
mm.
because when go fishing and some of the best fishermen I know, they treat it as a true art form and they are extremely intentional about it from
Yes.
waking up early, pre-planning their days ahead, doing the research on currents, on moon phases, where the fish are going to be located, how far they need to go out in the ocean to find the most plentiful, when are the fish going to be biting? I mean, all these different things that they're intentional about. Yet, how many of us are that intentional about the life we're trying to create for ourselves? Very
Mm,
few.
mm-hmm.
And so that's what it really became for me is this exercise of I had my actual self. I had found myself living as my ought self, meaning who I thought I should be because of all the obligations I felt were on my shoulders. But it's then how do you start bridging that gap between the odd self that you've become and the ideal self that you aspire to be. And to
Mm.
me, this really is the whole book exploration of then how do you build yourself into that fulfilling life that you aspire to have.
Yes.
And it
Yes.
all really starts and ends with you've got to find what your uniqueness is and the problem that you were called to solve that only you have the uniqueness to solve.
Mm. There were a couple of things that were coming to mind as you were speaking and you were sharing your own journey. And you said that there was an inner voice that was speaking to you. In order to hear an inner voice, you have to stop and listen. And most of us today are just
Yeah.
chasing after a result. And you talked about the fisherman and you were talking about intention. But the word process was coming to me also, that those fishermen, I bet you it's not just about catching the fish. It's about every one of those steps and enjoying the process of getting to that stage of fishing and actually having the fish on the end of the hook. And people today seem to just be after a result. They're after the result. They don't stop and enjoy the process along the way. They're not intentional in the way they live their lives, but they don't stop and listen either. They don't celebrate things. I mean, we really are living in a society where everyone's just on this mad rush, and there's burnout, there's stress, there's anxiety. And, good on you for taking that step and removing yourself out of that situation and having that foresight to do it. We're in a compare and despair society here. And a lot of that is through social media, where people are looking at the way other people are living their lives and wanting to live that same life and not being true to who they are and not being congruent. I mean, there's so many things we can talk about here, but I really want to move on to your book. So you're offering us some of the things that you use, some of the tools and the tips that you use to get yourself back on that life of living congruent. So your book, Passion Struck, 12 Powerful Principles to Unlock Your Purpose and Ignite Your Most Intentional Life. So as I said earlier, the book was released in February. It combines behavior science research and peak performance strategies. So we clearly know the inspiration of the book. So tell us about the book itself, how it's arranged, and what the 12 principles are that you talk about through the book.
The book is really arranged around something that I call the Passion Struck model, and it's made up of 4 components. So section 1 of the book is all based on 6 principles that all orient around mindset shifts. And the mindset shifts are extremely important because it is your mindset that really dictates the why that you end up taking the actions that you do, and it influences the how. The second section of the book goes into behavior shifts, and the behavior shifts also equate to 6 principles, and they build upon the mindset shifts. And this is really the what you are taking action against and how you're doing it. And then the last section of the book, I call the psychology of progress, but it's really about the interplay of taking deliberate action and the important fuel of intrinsic motivation. So that is how you put these 12 principles into the micro choices that make up your daily life. So it's how all those things come together, and especially how intrinsic motivation is the fuel that brings all of it into this fluid cycle, and all of it overarching underpins our sense of mattering and a feeling of significance that we have in the world. So with that as the backdrop, each one of the principles, I go through kind of a short, almost parable or metaphor describing it. I then go into kind of the behavior science or psychology behind the principle. I then introduce a personal story of how it's impacted my life. And then I go into 2 examples in each chapter. Some actually have more than that, of how some well-known people, such as Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson or Oprah Winfrey and other less well-known people, have implemented this in their lives, because I didn't want people to think that you had to be that star powered to put these principles into action. And so I have people like that to emphasize the points, but I also have what I call everyday heroes throughout the book as well, to show how regular people transform their lives using the principles.
Okay. So you start off by talking about the why. So when you talk about the why, is that our purpose, why we're wanting to implement change, what is important to us? Is that the why that gets us up out of bed every morning?
Yeah, the first 6 principles are really all about personal reinvention. And it starts with becoming the mission angler that I was talking about, which is all really the art of life crafting. And then at the end of it, I've got some chapter exercises that lead you down the path for how do you discover your purpose? How do you ignite it with passion? How do you go about finding your ideal self? How do you explore your uniquenesses? And then I provide QR codes as well that you can go to additional assets that I have available for even more information. And then from there, I really then go into this next chapter on what it means to become a brand reinventor, and why, as I examined over 750 different luminaries across all aspects of academia to CEOs to war heroes to astronauts, the one thing I found consistent, in addition to them following these 12 principles, was that they all constantly reinvent themselves. And a lot of times we feel like we're going to reach a point in life and then we stay stagnant there.
Mm-hmm.
These people don't do that. They constantly are reinventing themselves. So once they reach a plateau and they cross it, they set out their next plateau, learn more, and take on that next phase in life. And then it leads you into other things that you need to learn, such as how to put up proper boundaries to avoid toxic people and environments, how to overcome self doubt, how to use your perspective as a weapon, and why it's so important to learn the importance of dreaming your dream and not trying to dream someone else's.
That is all really powerful stuff. So powerful. And I absolutely relate to so much of what you were just talking about then. One of the things about that reinvention, that's really interesting, because you think that people that have made it in a certain area of their lives, that they would be happy and fulfilled to stay there. But you say that they keep reinventing themselves. So is that because they are trying to seek new purpose through life?
Well, I think it's some of that is there, but I think it's more that they understand that to stay on top and to be at the top of their game and to continually living a life that's passion struck, because b- becoming passion struck isn't an end state, it's an ever evolving version of yourself that's constantly
Mm,
striving to improve.
mm-hmm,
So it's a focus on reinventing to improve every area of yourself. And so it's this never ending process where you're constantly trying to learn to become better, because we all have ebbs and flows in our lives. And so it's recognizing those.
mm,
And when you're hitting them, and maybe when you're not finding that you have that motivation or that you need a new challenge, and doing the things that you need to do to reinvent yourself, to reposition yourself to, as you said, potentially follow a new purpose or to double down on the one you have, but doing it in different ways.
mm. So, with this book, what would you say is the greatest message that you're wanting to deliver?
I think the greatest message is that we don't have to put limits on how we perceive we have to live our life. And it all starts and ends with, if you want a 10x version of yourself, you have to start becoming that 10x version that you strive to be. And so a big area of the book then becomes, how do you lessen the activation energy that it takes to do just that? And if you think about this on a chart where one side is energy and the other side is intentional action, just think of the metaphor of a person who's having to roll their car up a hill.
Mm.
And as they're doing it and pushing it up the hill, that activation energy is extremely robust, because
Yes.
you have this huge force that's hitting you and you're trying to push it uphill. But if you
Mm-hmm.
think that then you've got the apex of the hill and then you've got a downhill after it, once you get that momentum going, your activation energy lowers. So, one of the key things is then, how do you figure out on the actions that you need to take to pursue the life that you want, that you lower the activation energy that's required to fuel those actions?
Mm-hmm.
Because actions build upon themselves, actions create other actions, and that's what builds the foundation. So it's really learning, how do you reduce that activation energy so that you lessen the friction for you to take continuing action to build that foundation upon which you can then
Mm.
take your life to wherever you want it.
So it's creating a momentum. It's like being that train that's unstoppable in your life, being that you have this life force and you're just propelling yourself forward and with the least amount of energy as possible.
I mean, that's part of it. And I think it's also, you need a measurement system, but you've got to put the right measurement system in place. Benjamin Hardy, who's a psychologist, wrote a great book a couple of years ago called The Gap and the Gain. And so many of us, when we're measuring ourselves, we measure ourselves in the gap, meaning the incremental progress that we make. We're constantly comparing ourselves to others
Mm.
around us. And
Mhm.
so it would be as, even though I'm a successful podcaster, it would be me trying to compare myself to Tim Ferriss or Joe Rogan or even
Yeah.
Jay Shetty, who've been
Yes.
doing it much longer than I have, who've had much greater success. And if I keep comparing myself to their achievements, I'm constantly going to be in the gap. What
Mm.
we really need to realize is that we need to compare ourselves in the gains. And this is when you look back at prior versions of yourself and you look at the progress that you've made incrementally along your growth pattern, and those are the gains that you've made. And I think it's a natural tendency to want to compare, but it's a huge mistake because the only person you should be comparing yourself to are the leaps that you've made from where
Yes.
you once were to where you
Yes.
want to become.
Exactly. Exactly. And this book is backed by science. Tell us about that. You said that you researched, you had a lot of people contribute to the book. How did you conduct that kind of research?
So it really started out with me working for a different company where I was the associate publisher for a publication they were doing. And I came up with this idea that I wanted to start spotlighting leaders in the business world. And so I started going down this path of creating these 8 to 10 different components that made a person a bold leader. And as I started to look at this and we started finding similarities in these 8 to 10 attributes, I started to naturally want to understand, were they also successful in their personal life and what
Mm.
set that apart? And so it really led me down this journey of start understanding what were these different characteristics that made people feel fulfilled in life and
Mm.
allowed them to get over self-doubt, to put up the boundaries that they needed to understand the power of being alone in our thoughts because we're completely immersed in the values that we have and we don't allow ourselves to teeter from them. Like, what were these
Mm.
things that made people so strong? And I ended up coming up initially with about a list of 30. And as I started studying more and more individuals, the list ended up getting up to about 750. I found 12
Oh,
that seemed to resonate more and more on a repetitive basis across the board. And those made up the principles in the book. And I kind of did it backwards because at this point, I was really looking at neuroscience primarily, as psychology secondarily, when about 4 years ago, I got really introduced to behavior science and realized that neuroscience is fantastic, but neuroscience really explains a longer term eventuality of our behavior, where behavior science can allow a person to take quicker action to
mm.
fulfill the direction that they wanted. And so I started to go down this path of just absorbing myself in as much behavior science as I could, which led me to want to start interviewing every renowned behavior scientist or psychologist who was in that field that I could. And so I ended up interviewing about 50 or 60 behavior scientists along the way.
Incredible.
And it just so happened that every single chapter is backed by behavior science. And I was able to incorporate those interviews into the book.
Wow. So that's really quite rigorous there. Yeah. And you recruited people like Oprah, The Rock. How were they? How did you find dealing with those people?
Well, some of
Was
these
Elon
people,
Musk as well? Yeah.
yeah, so some of these people I candidly interviewed, some of them I didn't. So, for instance, I did not get an opportunity to interview Oprah. I did interview Elon Musk. I did interview uh, General McChrystal, Keith Crotch, Jim McKelvey, who started Square, and a whole bunch of others. But
Mhm.
there were some I tried to get access to, but I couldn't. So I learned everything I could about them and then
Right.
used them in the book.
Mhm. Mhm. Incredible. Was there one of them that you thought, wow, I wasn't expecting that response, or someone who really inspired you in through their responses?
Yeah, I think Jim McKelvey is a great example of that. Jim is the founder, as I said, of Square, the payment
Mm,
system with Jack Dorsey. And I think what was really remarkable about Jim is just how learned he is in understanding how successful people operate and what makes successful entrepreneurs and non-successful entrepreneurs. And it really comes down to finding this burning problem that you were kind of born to solve. But that's not enough, because what ends up happening is oftentimes we find that problem, but
mm,
over time, as other things come up in our life, we lose focus on it. So it was really this immense focus and dedication that you have to it, even when things don't seem like they're going well. And they might be completely off the rails. You don't give up on it, you double down and you keep pushing forward. And it was that discipline that he had used on numerous startups that was really enlightening to me.
wow. A lot of people would be listening to this and thinking, you're talking about astronauts and you're talking about all these highly successful people. But I'm just someone who works in a store, or like me, I'm a singing teacher and I have a little podcast on the side. How does this relate to my life? And a lot of people would be going through the motions every day in their lives and not having that self realization that, they could be doing more, they could be achieving more. So, how do people go from where they're at, and how would the book benefit them?
So I think a lot of this comes down to self-love, honestly,
Mm,
because if you don't love the person who you are, you're never going to have the confidence to expand the horizons of what you think is possible, because you need to have that confidence in yourself that you
mm,
can do whatever it's going to take to achieve your goal. And even though I highlight people like these astronauts, I mean, a great example of this is one of them I profile in the book is Chris Cassidy. And Chris has a remarkable resume: Navy SEAL, Bronze Star with Valor, selected as an astronaut, becomes the chief astronaut, has one of the top 10, is known as having more spacewalks than any other astronaut, but maybe 5 or 6 other living ones. And he's now the head of uh, the Medal of Honor Museum in the United States. But when I first met Chris, he was 17 years old.
mm.
And we were doing push ups next to each other in goose poop at 3 o'clock in the morning in the military together.
Oh.
And when I talk to Chris even now, and I look at what has allowed him to live the life he has, it's because of the self love that he emulates. And he gave himself permission to take the chances that ended up
Mm,
resulting in where he is right now. And
mhm.
part of that was making difficult choices, such as when he was in SEALs, that when he was at BUDS, Basic Underwater Demolition School, that he might get kicked out for a medical issue. He might get kicked out because he can't pass it academically, but he is not going to drop out because mentally he's not strong enough.
Mm,
It was him, as he was a SEAL, charting the path that if he even wanted a chance to become an astronaut, what were the things that he needed to do to put himself in best position to do that, which
mhm.
for him meant he needed to get an advanced degree and he wanted to get into MIT. So it was then doing whatever he needed to do to get accepted. And then even when he was there, it was then understanding how do you put the application process in to become the astronaut. And then even when he became it, it was the desire that he wanted to spacewalk. So he knew in order to do that, he had to become the best at it that he possibly could. So it was just this intentional drive the whole way through his life to understand what he needed to do and to lower that activation energy that I was talking about so that he had the self-confidence to take that momentum forward, take the actions that he needed to build upon itself to eventualize what he wanted to become. And I
Mm,
mean, that's an extreme example, but it's the same
yes.
thing that we need to do. And I think
Mm,
what people don't realize, and you mentioned music, I'm right now starting down the path of trying to teach myself again how to play guitar. And I was listening
okay.
to Tim Ferriss talk
Mhm.
about this because he's trying to teach himself how to play drums. I already know how to play drums. But what he said, and it's absolutely true, is that if you do something 15 minutes a day throughout a year and you're consistent with it, you're going to be better at that activity than 97% of the rest of the world. And just 15
Really?
minutes a day, every single day.
And that is achievable. Everyone
And
can find 15 minutes a day. They can, if, really.
they can. So
Yeah.
it's just how you're utilizing your time. So
Mm,
I mean, you could be using 15 minutes a day to listen to Babel if you want to learn how to speak Spanish. And it's the consistency of doing that on a regular basis that makes all the differences in the world.
mm,
This isn't rocket science. If you want to have better health, it's being consistent about the food that you're putting in your body, the nutrients that you're putting in, the exercise that you're getting. It's the same thing in Chris's story, except he realized that in order to reach where he needed to reach, he
mm,
needed to be mentally strong. He needed to be physically strong. He had to
mm.
constantly learn. And it's just realizing that you have to do all these things and be consistent in their application.
Yeah. I find with my students, say that I teach at a university level, and the greatest obstacle that my students deal with is limiting belief, is breaking down those limiting beliefs. Is that something that you find is also a problem within our society, that we do walk around with these limiting beliefs that hold us back from living the life that we truly want to live or achieving those things that we want to achieve?
Yeah, I believe we all become our own visionary arsonist. And a
I
visionary
love that.
arsonist is someone who, with the best of intentions for personal growth and achievement, inadvertently undermines their own progress.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what
Mm-hmm.
happens is we set these big ambitions, these high ambitions, we dream big, but then we end up engaging in behaviors that are counterproductive to the goals. It's similar to programming a destination into your GPS, but then
Yeah.
repeatedly taking detours that lead you farther away.
Yeah.
And it's not due to a lack of desire or ability. It's the result of unconscious behaviors that are misaligned with our intended objectives.
Mm. Yeah.
And to me, a great example of this is if you have someone who's listening to this and they want to improve their fitness, but then they engage in procrastination or negative self talk that demotivates them despite their genuine desire to live healthier, their actions are driven by fear or unexamined habits that lead them away from the gym routine or healthy eating plan, whatever it is, because they're arsoning the very things that they want to achieve in life.
Mm. And
So
that,
signs
yeah.
that, yeah. So signs that you're actually a visionary arsonist include perfectionism, setting unrealistic goals, procrastination, negative self-talk, avoidant behaviors. It's when your actions consistently contradict your personal aspirations, leading to frustration and then a sense of being stuck.
Mm. And a lot of that too comes from lack of self-love too. There's
Exactly.
there's that, your self-worth. also thrown into the mix there. So we're going to start winding this up. This has been incredible and I'm really inspired. I'm going to go and get your book, John. So what is your legacy here?
So I wrote this for a wide group of people because I wanted this to inform many different camps. So I actually dedicate the book to my kids who, at the time that I wrote it, my daughter was 17 and my son at the time was 23. They're now 20 and 26. But I wanted it to be a guidebook for this generation that's coming up in a world that is far different from anything that our generation faced. I mean, the worries that they have about AI and digital changes and how quickly they're going to have to adapt are like nothing that we have seen in our lifetime.
Yeah.
However, what I try to tell my kids is that when I was growing up, I had huge fears myself. They're different fears, but I went into life thinking I'm never going to be able to live the dream life that I saw my parents live. I'm never going to be able to buy the house that they had. And if you live in that mode, you're never going to do it. So it's how do you create a different mindset of how you're approaching your life? And so that's what this book really does for that group of people, is it helps give them the keys to how do they approach their life and build it in a way that's going to make them resistant to the hardships that are coming their way and teach them how to become a constant learner. If you're someone who's stuck, it will teach you how to go from being stuck like I was to becoming passion struck. What is the formula from going and feeling like you're in quiet desperation to breaking free from it? If you're a high achiever, you can look at the principles and figure out where you sit by taking the passion struck quiz and then use it as a tool set to take you to the next level you want to achieve. So it can fit. I wrote it so it would fit multiple groups on their journey.
What did you learn about yourself through this process? Was there something that you thought, wow, I didn't realize this about myself? All these years, I thought I was John Miles and this is the person that I thought I was, but wow, I've discovered this through this journey of writing the book.
I think one of the things that I discovered is that real growth is actually like farming. It's not instant gratification, and it requires you to have consistent effort and practice, leading to exponential returns over time. And what I have learned from all the science that I have studied and seeing what works and doesn't is you have to be intentional about how you align your actions with your ambitions and your long-term aspirations. And to start seeing that the lulls and the plateaus on the way to achieving those ambitions and then aspirations are not failures, but stages for future growth. But the most important thing is the power of choice. And it's not the big choices I have found in life that end up defining us. It's the myriad of micro choices that we make on a daily basis that either lead to a tsunami of greatness or a valley of despair because we end up being consistent in making the wrong choices, or we become consistent in making choices like I talked about with Chris Cassidy that build upon each other. So it's really learning how to start lessening that activation energy so that you're making more and more of these micro choices that build upon each other, become easier over time, and become more a windfall than a headwind.
Is there anything else that you wanted to add to this interview that perhaps we haven't touched on and you feel is important that you'd like to contribute or that you feel our listeners should know about?
Yeah, one of the favorite chapters that I have in the book was on something that I call the conscious engager. And we often hear people say, I'm living my life on autopilot. And I think some people are, but I think for the vast majority of us, it's the wrong metaphor. Because I've spent a lot of time over the past couple of weeks on airplanes, and I guarantee the pilots who are flying it, probably 90% of the time, they're on autopilot. And when I think of autopilot, yes, you're going through the motions, but you're typically heading in a positive direction.
Mm,
I think the better analogy, which I define in this chapter for how so many of us are living our lives, is as if we're a pinball. We are living a pinball life. We're
mm,
as if we are that unintentional pinball in the game that is just bouncing off everything that's around us. And the digital apparatus that has come over the past decade, the social media tools, everything is just making this pinball life easier and
mm.
easier to fall into that trap.
Yes, yes,
And so, really, what life then, the better analogy is instead of letting the game play you, because the game of life is similar to pinball. I mean, it really is
yes,
a
because
game
we're
of
kind of like, but we're also bouncing off all these different, we're hitting obstacles, aren't we, in life?
right. So
And
the critical
yeah,
thing that I found was that ultimately what I discovered when I was at that low point in my career was I had become extremely fantastic at making other people's dreams come true and being the pinball bouncing around other people's games.
mm,
But I wasn't being intentional about taking control of the pinball and playing it intentionally in the way that I wanted to, meaning I was so good at making other people's dreams come true, I wasn't making my own dreams come true. And that is really the whole purpose of our whole discussion today and this book is how do you intentionally become the player of the game of pinball to influence winning the game and playing it on your terms.
mm. I love that. I love that because people don't realize that they're being influenced by other people, whether it is something on social media, whether it's the people around them, whether it's in their job. There's all these external influences, and we have to really be true to who we are and what our mission and what our own purpose is in life. John, thank you so much. We are going to share the links to your book to you if people want to learn more. What are you up to next?
So, right now, I am working on trying to get a book tour underway, which I hope could become a global book tour. Been trying to really hone my keynote apparatus so I can start doing those again on a much larger basis. I'm currently working on what I call the Passion Struck University, which is taking the principles that are in the book and turning them into an app and online courses that people can utilize to augment the book
Wow.
even more. And I've been really fortunate. I was recently picked up as part of the SiriusXM network. And so I'm looking at expanding the podcast that I'm doing now with the Passion Struck podcast and bringing on some additional podcast under that umbrella.
Hmm. Amazing. Well done to you. I wish you all the very best. And I do appreciate your time. And people go out and buy John's book. I'm going to go and buy it. It sounds amazing. And I resonate with so much of what you were speaking about on the show today. All the very best, John. And thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, Marissa, thank you so much for having me. And I really appreciate the Australian audience. I loved my time when I was there in Sydney, one of the best places
Mm,
and best countries in the whole world. So
yes.
thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Take care, John.